There comes a moment in every person's life when something inside them goes quiet, not because they have found peace, not because the world has finally become kind, but because they have reached the end of carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations. Have you ever noticed how some people only appreciate your kindness when it benefits them? How they praise your patience while quietly taking advantage of it? They call you understanding because it allows them to avoid accountability. They call you compassionate because it gives them permission to keep crossing your boundaries. And for years you believe that this is love. You convince yourself that if you just forgive one more time, stay silent one more time, explain yourself one more time, eventually they will see your heart. But what if they already saw your heart? What if they knew exactly how much you could endure? What if your endless forgiveness never inspired change? It simply taught people how much they could get away with. That is the terrifying truth very few are willing to face, because the day the kindest soul decides, no more, something extraordinary happens. The people who claimed to love them begin to panic. The ones who preached loyalty suddenly become angry. The ones who spoke about family, friendship, commitment, and respect reveal emotions you have never seen before. Why? Because your forgiveness was never just forgiveness. It was the stage on which everyone else performed. And the moment the curtain falls, every mask falls with it. This is not a story about revenge. It is not about becoming cold or cruel. It is about discovering that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to continue betraying yourself. Stay with me until the end, because what you are about to hear may explain years of confusion, guilt, and emotional exhaustion in a way you've never considered before. And once you truly understand it, you will never look at your relationships or yourself the same way again. Most people spend their entire lives believing that goodness is measured by sacrifice. They are taught this lesson long before they can question it. Be polite. Don't make people uncomfortable. Always forgive. Always understand. Always be the bigger person. Smile, even when you're hurting. Stay calm, even when you're being disrespected. Give another chance, then another, and another. Little by little, a dangerous belief begins to grow inside them. They start believing that their worth depends on how much pain they can quietly endure. At first, this seems noble. The world applauds these people. Friends describe them as selfless. Family calls them dependable. Coworkers say they're easy to work with. Partners say they're incredibly patient. But beneath every compliment, another invisible brick is placed upon their shoulders. Without realizing it, they begin carrying emotional burdens that were never theirs to carry. They become the listener for everyone else's problems, the peacemaker in every argument, the rescuer in every crisis, the one who apologizes just to end the conflict, even when they did nothing wrong. Slowly, their identity becomes tied to fixing everyone else. And because they are so focused on understanding others, they stop asking a question that could change everything. Who is understanding me? That question feels almost forbidden, selfish, uncomfortable. So they silence it before it can fully form. Instead, they keep giving, not because they are weak, but because they genuinely believe love is something that must be earned through endless patience. What they don't realize is that patience without boundaries slowly transforms into permission. Every time disrespect is excused, every broken promise justified, every betrayal minimized, a silent message is being sent. You can do this again. Human beings learn through repetition, not merely through words. If someone repeatedly hurts you and discovers that forgiveness always arrives before consequences, they unconsciously begin expecting forgiveness as part of the pattern. It becomes predictable, normal, almost automatic. This doesn't necessarily make them evil. It simply reveals something deeply human. People naturally adjust to the boundaries, or lack of boundaries, that surround them. Imagine walking through a house where every door is unlocked. At first you knock, eventually you stop knocking, not because you intended to become disrespectful, but because the environment quietly taught you that permission was always available. Relationships work much the same way. When kindness exists without limits, many people stop recognizing it as a gift. They begin treating it as an obligation. They no longer say thank you. They begin expecting it. This is how extraordinary compassion slowly becomes invisible. Not because compassion loses value, but because familiarity blinds people to what they receive every day. Think about sunlight. Most people don't celebrate it every morning. Yet, let darkness remain for just a few hours, and suddenly everyone notices what was always there. The same happens with genuine kindness. As long as it never disappears, few recognize its true worth. This creates a painful paradox. The kinder a person becomes, the less visible their sacrifices often become, not intentionally, simply psychologically. The human mind adapts astonishingly fast to comfort. We normalize blessings. We become accustomed to emotional safety. We forget that someone's patience is not infinite simply because it has lasted for years. Deep within every gentle soul lives another side rarely acknowledged, a side that grows quieter each time it is ignored, not weaker, quieter. There is an important difference. Silence should never be mistaken for absence. Many believe that people who avoid conflict have no anger. This is one of the greatest misunderstandings about human nature. Avoiding conflict often requires tremendous emotional strength. It demands swallowing words that desperately want to be spoken. It demands calming storms that no one else can see. It demands carrying disappointments in complete silence while still showing kindness to the very people who caused them. But emotions do not disappear simply because they remain unspoken. They descend, they wait, like seeds buried beneath frozen ground, invisible, yet very much alive. Inside every person exists parts of themselves they rarely show the world: the compassionate side, the fearful side, The ambitious side, the wounded child, the silent observer, the fierce protector. When these parts remain balanced, life feels authentic. But when one side dominates completely, the neglected parts do not vanish. They retreat into the unconscious waiting, watching, growing stronger in the shadows. A person who identifies only as the nice one often hides an enormous amount of unexpressed anger, not because anger is wrong, but because they have convinced themselves that feeling it would make them unlovable. So instead of expressing healthy anger, they suppress it again and again and again. Years pass, smiles remain, conversations continue. Life appears normal, but beneath that calm surface, something powerful is quietly gathering. Every ignored insult, every broken trust, every moment of emotional abandonment, every sacrifice no one noticed, none of it disappears. The human soul remembers what the conscious mind tries to forget. It stores unfinished emotions with astonishing precision. Eventually, a strange exhaustion begins to appear. Not physical exhaustion, something deeper, a weariness that sleep cannot fix. The kind of fatigue that follows years of pretending everything is okay. You wake up tired. You answer messages you don't want to answer. You attend gatherings where your smile feels borrowed. You keep showing up for everyone else while secretly wondering why no one ever seems to notice you're falling apart. This is not laziness nor weakness. It is the cost of living too far away from yourself. Many people mistake this exhaustion for depression. Sometimes it is, but often it is something else. It is the soul quietly whispering, I cannot continue living against my own truth. At first, the whisper is easy to ignore. You distract yourself, you stay busy, you tell yourself things will improve. You blame stress, you blame work, you blame circumstances, anything except the possibility that your greatest source of pain is the role you've been playing for years, the role of the endlessly understanding person, the endlessly available friend, the endlessly forgiving partner, the endlessly dependable child, the endlessly patient parent, the role that earned applause from everyone except the one person who desperately needed your compassion, you. The tragedy is not that compassionate people care deeply. The tragedy is that somewhere along the way, many of them were taught that caring for themselves meant caring less for others. Nothing could be further from the truth, because a heart that is never protected eventually becomes too exhausted to love freely. A soul that is never respected begins to confuse suffering with purpose. And a person who is always expected to forgive slowly forgets what it feels like to be truly seen. The quiet transformation does not begin with anger. It begins with awareness. One ordinary day, after years of carrying what never belonged to them, a simple realization slips into their mind with startling clarity. It is not dramatic, it is not loud, yet it changes everything. Maybe I was never asking for too much. Maybe I was simply giving far more than anyone ever stopped to notice. That realization is both liberating and terrifying. Because the moment you begin to question the role you've always played, you also begin to question every relationship that depended on it. You look around, not with bitterness, but with new eyes. Conversations that once felt normal suddenly feel one-sided. Promises that used to comfort you begin to sound empty. The effort you've poured into keeping everyone else emotionally safe becomes impossible to ignore. For years, you believed you were building strong relationships. Now you wonder whether you were simply building habits. There is a profound difference. Love grows through mutual responsibility. Habits grow through repetition. When one person always apologizes first, the other becomes accustomed to never apologizing at all. When one person always reaches out after every disagreement, the other stops feeling the urgency to repair what they have broken. When one person constantly explains away hurtful behavior, the other slowly loses the motivation to change it. This is how imbalance quietly disguises itself as loyalty. No one wakes up one morning and decides to become emotionally taken for granted. It happens gradually, almost invisibly, through hundreds of ordinary moments. A cancelled plan you excuse, a harsh comment you pretend didn't sting, a forgotten promise you convince yourself wasn't important, a boundary crossed that you quietly redraw instead of defending. Each moment seems too small to matter, yet together they become the architecture of an unhealthy relationship. The strange thing about emotional exhaustion is that it rarely arrives all at once. It accumulates like drops of water filling a glass. One drop changes nothing, neither does the second or the hundredth, but eventually one final drop falls, and suddenly the glass overflows. To everyone watching from the outside, it appears to happen without warning. They say, "You've changed, you've become distant, you're overreacting. I don't understand what happened." But they are only seeing the last drop. They never noticed the thousands that came before it. This is why those who have benefited most from your silence are often the most shocked by your voice. They mistake your boundaries for hostility because they have never experienced them before. What they call coldness is often simply the absence of unlimited access. What they call selfishness is often the beginning of self-respect. There is another force that keeps compassionate people trapped long after they recognize the imbalance. It is guilt. Guilt is one of the most powerful emotional chains a human being can wear, not because it is always truthful, but because it sounds truthful. It whispers in a familiar voice, "What if you're being unfair? What if they're trying their best? What if you're expecting too much? What if leaving makes you the bad person?" Notice something remarkable. Guilt almost never asks whether you are being treated fairly. It only asks whether everyone else is. It places the entire burden of preserving harmony upon your shoulders. And because you have spent years measuring your worth by how much peace you can create, you mistake guilt for morality. Yet the two are not the same. Sometimes guilt simply appears because you are doing something unfamiliar. A child feels guilty the first time they say no to a demanding parent, not because saying no is wrong, but because obedience has become their identity. The same happens in adulthood. When someone has spent years putting themselves last, choosing themselves feels almost unnatural, not because it is selfish, because it is new. Growth often feels like betrayal before it feels like freedom. That is one of life's quiet paradoxes. The person who has ignored themselves for years rarely recognizes self-respect when it finally arrives. Instead, they mistake it for cruelty. Imagine someone who has lived their entire life inside a dimly lit room. When they finally step into sunlight, the brightness hurts their eyes. They may even long for the darkness again, not because darkness was healthier, because it was familiar. Emotional patterns work the same way. People return to unhealthy relationships not because suffering feels good. They return because suffering feels known. The unknown, even when healthier, can feel frightening. Our minds naturally cling to what is predictable, even if what is predictable is painful. This explains why so many compassionate people forgive long after hope has quietly disappeared. They are not simply attached to another person, they are attached to the identity they built around saving them. If the other person changes, wonderful. If they don't, perhaps I can love them enough for both of us. Perhaps my patience will heal them. Perhaps my understanding will finally make them understand me. But healing has never been something one person can perform on another through sacrifice alone. You cannot carry another person's responsibility without eventually dropping your own. You cannot rescue someone who insists on remaining asleep. No matter how loudly you call their name, one of the greatest illusions we carry is the belief that if we explain ourselves clearly enough, everyone will finally understand us. So we explain again and again and again. We rewrite messages before sending them. We rehearse conversations in our minds. We search for perfect words that will somehow unlock another person's empathy. Yet there comes a painful realization. People do not misunderstand us as often as we imagine. Sometimes they understand perfectly. They simply value different things. This realization is difficult because it removes our final excuse. As long as we believe communication is the problem, hope survives. But when we realize the issue is not understanding, but unwillingness, something inside us shifts forever. You stop trying to convince people of your worth. You stop begging for the bare minimum. You stop performing emotional labor for those who have never once wondered how heavy it has become. This is where many people become afraid. They fear that becoming stronger means becoming harder, that setting boundaries requires losing kindness. But strength and harshness have never been the same thing. A tree does not become cruel because its roots grow deeper. A mountain does not become arrogant because it refuses to move for every passing storm. Likewise, a compassionate heart does not lose its beauty when it learns to protect itself. In truth, protection allows compassion to survive. Without it, kindness becomes exploitation disguised as virtue. There is a hidden danger in believing that being needed is the same as being loved. Many people spend decades confusing the two. If everyone depends on me, I must matter. If everyone comes to me with their problems, I must be valuable. If I stop helping, perhaps no one will stay. This fear is rarely conscious. It hides beneath years of habits, but it quietly influences every decision. It convinces people to tolerate disrespect because loneliness seems more frightening than disappointment. It persuades them to remain available long after they are emotionally empty. It tells them that losing relationships is worse than losing themselves. Yet consider this: if someone only remains in your life because you continually abandon yourself to keep them comfortable, what exactly are they attached to? You? Or the version of you that never asks for anything? There is a painful honesty in that question, because genuine love does not require you to disappear. It asks you to become more fully yourself. Anything that demands the death of your authenticity in exchange for acceptance is not love. It is dependency wearing love's clothing. This is why the journey toward wholeness often feels lonely before it feels peaceful. As you begin changing, familiar relationships become unsettled. Some people celebrate your growth, others quietly resist it, not because your boundaries hurt them, because your boundaries expose them. The person who respected you all along adjusts naturally. The person who benefited from your lack of boundaries suddenly feels deprived. And in that moment, hidden motives begin revealing themselves, not through your accusations, through their reactions. Pay close attention to how people respond when you calmly say no. That single word often reveals more truth than years of conversation. Some will respect it immediately. Some will ask questions with genuine curiosity. Some will seek compromise. And some will become angry, manipulative, or strangely offended. The response itself becomes a mirror. It reflects whether they valued your humanity or merely your availability. Perhaps the greatest transformation is this: you slowly stop asking, "How can I make everyone understand me?" and begin asking a far wiser question: what part of myself have I abandoned in order to keep everyone else comfortable? The answer rarely arrives overnight. It appears through quiet moments, moments when you finally sit alone without rushing to fix someone else's crisis, moments when silence no longer feels empty but revealing, moments when you realize that peace has a different sound than approval. Approval is loud. It depends on applause, reassurance, and constant validation. Peace is almost silent. It asks for nothing except honesty. And honesty has a remarkable way of dismantling illusions that years of comfort could never touch. Little by little, the person who once feared disappointing everyone begins to understand something that changes the course of their life. Disappointing others is sometimes the unavoidable cost of finally refusing to disappoint yourself. That understanding does not make the heart smaller, it makes it wiser, because wisdom is not the absence of compassion. Wisdom is compassion that has finally learned the difference between saving someone and sacrificing itself. There is a moment that almost no one notices when it first arrives. It does not announce itself with anger. It does not arrive with a dramatic goodbye or a final argument. It begins with silence, a different kind of silence than before. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of swallowing your feelings, not the silence of hoping someone will finally understand. This silence is peaceful. It is the silence of someone who has stopped negotiating with their own soul. Something inside them has shifted so deeply that the need to explain begins to disappear. They no longer rehearse conversations before going to sleep. They no longer spend hours wondering whether they were too sensitive. They no longer carry the impossible responsibility of making sure everyone else is comfortable while they quietly fall apart. Instead, they begin listening to a voice they ignored for years, a quiet voice that asks only one question: what if my peace matters too? At first, the question feels unfamiliar, almost dangerous. For someone who has spent a lifetime placing themselves last, choosing peace can feel strangely uncomfortable. But once that question has been asked honestly, it cannot be unheard. It follows them into every conversation, every relationship, every decision, and slowly, almost without realizing it, they begin behaving differently. They answer messages when they have the emotional energy instead of immediately out of guilt. They stop apologizing for needing rest. They no longer explain every boundary as though it requires permission. They stop chasing people who have repeatedly shown them they are willing to walk away. To outsiders, these changes seem small. To the person experiencing them, they feel revolutionary because, for the first time, their actions begin reflecting self-respect instead of self-abandonment. This is the moment many relationships begin to change, not because the compassionate person has become unrecognizable, but because everyone else has lost access to the version of them that accepted everything. The reactions come quickly. Some people become confused. You've changed. Others become defensive. You think you're better than everyone now. Some attempt guilt. After everything I've been through, this is how you treat me? Others become strangely nostalgic. I miss the old you. Listen carefully to those words. I miss the old you. Often, what they truly mean is, I miss the version of you that never challenged me, the version who absorbed every disappointment without complaint, the version who carried emotional burdens that were never theirs, the version who believed love meant endless endurance. But that version was never the real person. It was a survival strategy. And survival strategies are not meant to become identities. There is something remarkable that happens when endless forgiveness finally comes to an end. Truth begins revealing itself without anyone intending it to. You do not need to expose people. You simply stop protecting the lies they have become comfortable hiding behind. Imagine standing in a room where every mirror has been covered for years. Everyone has grown accustomed to believing whatever image they wish. Now imagine removing the covers. The mirrors do not attack anyone, they simply reflect. Some people smile because they are comfortable with what they see, others become angry, not because the mirror lied, because it refused to. Healthy boundaries function much like those mirrors. They reveal rather than create. A respectful person sees your boundary and adjusts. A manipulative person sees your boundary as an obstacle. An emotionally mature person asks how they can honor it. An entitled person asks why you suddenly have one. The boundary changes very little. It is the reaction that tells the story. This is why people often say that when the kindest soul finally says enough, everyone's true character becomes visible. Not because the compassionate person suddenly gains magical insight, because they stop interrupting reality. For years, they explained away behavior that should have been acknowledged. They translated disrespect into stress, neglect into busyness, cruelty into misunderstanding, broken promises into temporary mistakes. Their compassion became a filter that softened every painful truth. Once the filter is removed, nothing new has appeared. Reality has simply become impossible to ignore. There is grief in this awakening, not because you lose people, but because you lose illusions. You mourn the relationship you believed you had. You mourn the future you imagined together. You mourn the countless moments when you convinced yourself that tomorrow would be different. Perhaps the deepest grief of all is realizing how often you abandoned yourself while waiting for someone else to change. That realization hurts. Not because you were foolish, but because you loved sincerely. There is courage in sincere love, even when it is misplaced. Yet love without awareness can become a prison. You begin giving not from abundance, but from fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of being misunderstood, fear of ending up alone. Eventually, those fears begin making decisions on your behalf. Without realizing it, you are no longer living according to your values. You are living according to your anxieties. Freedom begins the moment you recognize the difference. It is tempting to believe that this transformation ends with confrontation, that one powerful conversation will solve everything. Life is rarely so dramatic. More often, transformation is almost invisible. You simply stop participating in patterns that no longer honor your dignity. You no longer argue with people determined to misunderstand you. You no longer spend hours defending your intentions. You no longer chase closure from those who have no interest in giving it. Instead, you allow silence to complete conversations words never could. This surprises many people. They expected another argument, another explanation, another opportunity to persuade you. Instead, they receive calm. And calm is difficult to manipulate. Emotional chaos feeds on reaction. Manipulation depends upon guilt. Control requires participation. But peace quietly removes itself from games it no longer wishes to play. Some people mistake this calm for emotional distance. It is nothing of the sort. It is emotional clarity. The difference is profound distance says, I no longer care. Clarity says, I care enough to stop destroying myself. That distinction changes everything. There is another unexpected consequence of choosing yourself. You begin recognizing others who have been doing the same all along. You notice people who respect your time without demanding it, people who apologize without being forced, people who celebrate your happiness instead of competing with it, people who ask how you are and actually wait for the answer. Suddenly, you realize something extraordinary. Healthy relationships never required you to disappear. They simply required honesty. Perhaps this is why authenticity feels so peaceful. It asks for no performance, no masks, no endless emotional calculations, no pretending to be okay because everyone else expects you to be. Authenticity allows both strength and tenderness to exist together. You can forgive without forgetting. You can love without losing yourself. You can help without carrying another person's entire life. You can walk away without hatred. Many misunderstand forgiveness itself. They imagine it means reopening every closed door, returning every time someone knocks, offering endless opportunities without evidence of change. But true forgiveness is far quieter than that. It is releasing the desire for revenge. It is refusing to let resentment poison your own heart. It is accepting that what happened cannot be changed. Forgiveness is an inner act. Reconciliation is a shared decision. The two are not the same. You may forgive someone completely and still recognize that trusting them again would require denying everything experience has taught you. There is wisdom in that. Compassion does not demand amnesia. Love does not require blindness. Mercy does not erase discernment. As this understanding deepens, something remarkable begins happening inside. The anger you feared for so long slowly transforms. It becomes grief, then understanding, then quiet strength. You realize your anger was never your enemy. It was a messenger. It arrived carrying a simple truth. Something precious inside you has been neglected. Once the message has been heard, the anger no longer needs to shout. It has fulfilled its purpose. This is why the strongest people are rarely the loudest. They have already fought their greatest battle within themselves. They no longer need to convince the world of their worth. They have finally convinced themselves. And when that happens, relation loses its power. Manipulation loses its power. Fear loses much of its power. Because the person who once searched endlessly for acceptance has discovered something infinitely more valuable: self-respect. It cannot be given by applause. It cannot be taken away by rejection. It grows quietly every time you choose truth over comfort. Every time you honor your intuition instead of your fear. Every time you stop asking, will they still like me? And begin asking, can I still recognize myself if I keep saying yes to this? That single question becomes a compass. It guides decisions more faithfully than approval ever could. The journey is not about becoming harder. It is about becoming whole. Wholeness welcomes every part of who you are, your kindness, your courage, your vulnerability, your discernment, your compassion, and yes, even your ability to say with complete peace, no. For years, that word felt impossible because it sounded like rejection. Now it sounds like honesty. Not honesty toward others first, but honesty toward yourself. And it is in that quiet honesty that the greatest illusion finally collapses. You discover that the people who truly loved you never needed endless access to your energy. They only needed your authentic presence. Everyone else needed your endless sacrifice. The difference becomes impossible to ignore. And once you have seen it, no mask, no matter how convincing, can ever fully hide the truth again. Once you reach this place, people often assume the journey is over. They believe the hardest part was learning to say no. They imagine that once the masks have fallen, life becomes simple. But truth has never promised simplicity. It has only promised freedom. And freedom carries a responsibility many people underestimate. When you stop living according to everyone else's expectations, you are finally left alone with yourself. No distractions, no performances, no role to play, only the quiet question that has been waiting beneath every fear you have ever carried. Who am I when I no longer need to be who everyone expects me to be? That question cannot be answered in a single afternoon. It unfolds over months, sometimes years, because the person you are discovering was hidden beneath layers of conditioning, obligation, guilt, and survival. For so long, your identity was built upon what you gave. Now it must be rebuilt upon who you are. That difference changes everything. You begin noticing things you never allowed yourself to notice before. You laugh without wondering whether someone will judge you. You rest without apologizing for being tired. You choose relationships that feel peaceful instead of exciting for the wrong reasons. You stop confusing emotional intensity with emotional intimacy. You realize that chaos was never proof of love. It was proof that something inside you still believed suffering had to be earned before happiness was deserved. That belief quietly dissolves, and as it disappears, another truth begins taking its place. Peace is not something you find. Peace is something you stop abandoning. Every time you betray your own values to avoid disappointing someone else, you move further away from it. Every time you silence your intuition because you fear another person's reaction, you drift even farther. But every honest decision, every healthy boundary, every moment of self-respect becomes another step home. There is a reason so many people fear becoming authentic. Authenticity costs something. It costs false acceptance. It costs relationships built upon pretending. It costs approval from people who only loved the version of you that never challenged them. That price can feel painfully high until one day you discover the cost of remaining inauthentic was even higher. You were paying with your joy, your confidence, your energy, your voice, your life. No relationship is worth that price Because the greatest tragedy is not losing people who refuse to honor your worth. The greatest tragedy is losing yourself while trying to keep them. Many spend decades searching for the right person, the right opportunity, the right purpose, believing fulfillment exists somewhere outside themselves. Yet the deepest transformation begins in a far quieter place. It begins the moment you stop asking, "Who will finally choose me?" and begin asking, "Why have I spent so many years refusing to choose myself?" The answer is rarely comfortable. Perhaps you feared abandonment. Perhaps you confused sacrifice with love. Perhaps you believed that if you became indispensable enough, no one would ever leave. But no amount of usefulness can guarantee genuine connection. People may depend upon your generosity without ever truly seeing your humanity. And there is an enormous difference between being appreciated for what you do and being loved for who you are. The first creates exhaustion. The second creates belonging. As your understanding deepens, forgiveness itself begins changing. You no longer forgive because you are afraid of conflict. You forgive because you refuse to let bitterness become your identity. You no longer forgive in order to keep people close. You forgive so your own heart remains free. You no longer forgive while abandoning wisdom. You forgive while remembering the lessons experience carved into your soul. There is no contradiction in loving someone and recognizing they can no longer walk beside you. Sometimes love expresses itself through presence, sometimes through distance. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for another person is allow them to experience the consequences you spent years protecting them from. Growth rarely happens where every mistake is rescued. Responsibility cannot develop where accountability is constantly removed. This applies not only to others, it applies to ourselves as well. Every painful experience carries a hidden invitation not to become cynical, not to become suspicious of everyone, but to become more conscious, to recognize the difference between empathy and self-erasure, between compassion and compliance, between patience and fear, between love and dependency. Awareness changes everything. Once your eyes have adjusted to truth, illusion becomes difficult to tolerate. You notice manipulation hidden inside compliments, control disguised as concern, possessiveness disguised as protection, conditional affection disguised as loyalty. Not because you have become negative, because your perception has become clearer. Clarity is not pessimism. Clarity simply refuses to decorate reality. And reality, when accepted fully, becomes surprisingly peaceful. You stop trying to rewrite other people's stories. You stop exhausting yourself attempting to awaken those committed to remaining asleep. You finally understand that every human being must confront their own shadow in their own time. No lecture can replace experience. No sacrifice can substitute for another person's willingness to grow. You can inspire, you can encourage, you can love, but you cannot live another person's inner journey for them. The burden you carried for so many years was never yours. Setting it down is not failure. It is wisdom. There is an old illusion that strength means never breaking. Life teaches something different. Strength often grows precisely because we have broken. The cracks we tried so desperately to hide become the places where understanding enters. Compassion becomes deeper because we have suffered. Discernment becomes sharper because we have trusted the wrong people. Courage becomes quieter because we no longer need to prove it. The person standing before the world now is not the same person who once believed silence was the price of belonging. They still possess a gentle heart, but now that heart has eyes. It can recognize sincerity. It can recognize manipulation. It can recognize the subtle difference between someone reaching for connection and someone reaching for control. This awareness does not make life lonely, it makes relationships honest. And honesty is the foundation upon which every lasting bond must stand. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. The purpose of your kindness was never to become a door through which everyone could walk without knocking. Its purpose was to become a light that offers warmth without burning itself away, a light that guides without losing its own flame, a light that knows when to shine and when to step back from those determined to extinguish it. One day, someone will meet the version of you who no longer apologizes for existing. They will notice that your kindness is still there. Your compassion is still there. Your generosity is still there. But something has changed. There is a quiet strength in your presence, a calm confidence that no longer begs to be understood. You will not have to announce your boundaries. They will be felt. You will not have to convince people of your value. Those capable of seeing it will recognize it naturally. Those who cannot were never truly looking. And if some people walk away because they no longer benefit from unlimited access to your heart, let them go without resentment. Not everyone is meant to remain in every chapter of your life. Some people arrive to teach you what love is. Others arrive to teach you what love is not. Both lessons are valuable. Both shape your becoming. The journey was never about becoming less compassionate. It was about allowing compassion to include yourself. Because the moment your kindness embraces your own soul with the same tenderness it has always offered everyone else, something extraordinary happens. You no longer seek permission to exist. You no longer chase acceptance at the expense of authenticity. You no longer mistake endurance for virtue. You stand quietly in your truth, and in that quietness, there is a power no amount of noise can overcome. So if today you find yourself standing at the edge of a difficult decision, if your heart is exhausted from carrying burdens that were never yours, if guilt whispers that choosing yourself makes you selfish, listen instead to the quieter voice beneath it. The voice that has never stopped calling you home. The voice that reminds you your compassion was never meant to become your prison. Your forgiveness was never meant to become permission for endless disrespect. Your love was never meant to require